Welcome back to our channel. He married a 17-year-old girl on The Tonight Show in 1969 in front of 45 million viewers. However, Tiny Tim's strange decline didn't end there. The foul Christmas song that killed his career, his obsession with adult diapers, and his compulsive showering all contributed to one horrific night that permanently barred him from television. This is the weird, depressing tale they didn't want you to know. Little Tim was born Herbert Boutros Corey in Manhattan, New York City, on April 12, 1932. The son of a Maronite Catholic priest, his father, Boutros Corey, was a textile worker from Beirut, Lebanon. Tilly Staff, his mother, was a Polish Jewish fabric worker who came to the U.S. from Brest-Litovsk in 1914. They resided in Washington Heights, an area where many immigrants sought better prospects. Herbert's parents put a lot of effort into providing him with a secure life, yet he never showed interest in everyday objects. He lost himself in the music while the other children played outdoors. His father brought a wind-up gramophone and a 78 RPM copy of Henry Burr's Beautiful Ohio home when he was 5 years old. All of it changed with just one record. He was utterly enthralled and played it repeatedly. The music wasn't the only thing. It was the sensation, the universe it made. He began teaching himself to play the guitar when he was 6 years old. His new fascination began a few years later when he heard Arthur Godfrey playing the ukulele on the radio. Music wasn't merely a pastime. He managed to get away. While the majority of children his age listened to whatever was in style, Herbert spent hours at the New York Public Library searching through early 1900s sheet music and phonograph records. By his adolescent years, he knew more about lost songs and performers than most historians, demonstrating his desire to comprehend the music of the past. He never gave school priority. He struggled academically and with fitting in at George Washington High School. Science and mathematics didn't interest him. All he was interested in was music. He repeatedly failed his second year before dropping out. His future was a concern for his parents. However, his decision was already set. Although he worked at odd jobs to make ends meet, his true passion was music. It was about this time that he found something that would make him unique. He had been enjoying the 1920s singer Rudy Vallee, who was well known for having a high, almost spectral voice. This gave Herbert the idea to try his hand at singing in falsetto. Initially, it seemed odd, but then it felt perfect. He subsequently referred to this experience as a religious encounter. It wasn't merely a method. It was who he was, his voice. However, Herbert Corey was aware that his name wasn't very memorable. He began using a variety of stage names in the hopes that one would stick. He attempted Sir Timothy Timmons, Derry Dover, Julian Foxglove, and Larry Love in the hopes that the correct name would help him. They were all unsuccessful. Then, in 1960, his management came up with a new moniker that was straightforward but witty. Tim Little. Adapted from the brittle yet optimistic character in A Christmas Carol, it seemed an odd choice for a 6'1" person, but it worked. The name was accompanied with a new persona. Unlike many people in the 1950s, he grew his hair long. He appeared as though he had jumped out of another period because of his brilliant, distinctive attire. Because he thought it represented freshness and purity, he even powdered his face white. He had evolved beyond his musical career. He had developed into a character. Tiny Tim was unique, and soon the world would recognize him for his ukulele, old-fashioned melodies, and falsetto voice. The adventure of Tiny Tim started in one of New York City's most peculiar locations. He gave performances at the Dime Museum in Times Square, Hubert's Museum, and Live Flea Circus, which had been operating since 1925, in the late 1950s. Sword swallowers, tattooed women, sideshow performers, and even a flea circus with actual fleas pulling little chariots were all over the area. Little Tim was a perfect fit. Under the stage name Larry Love, the Singing Canary, he sang classic Tin Pan Alley tunes in his distinctive falsetto. Even in a room full of human anomalies, he stood out due to his 6 feet of height, long hair, and white facial makeup. People nicknamed him Human Canary. Hubert served as a training field and a battleground. People had a hard time taking him seriously as a musician because of the freak show atmosphere. Even though he stood out among the others, the experience molded him. He mastered the knack of capturing an audience's interest and embracing his uniqueness. He left Hubert's in 1960 to pursue greater ambitions in Greenwich Village since he had outgrown it. The village was not an easy place to live. Tiny Tim performed under the identities Sir Timothy Timms and Derry Dover on every platform that would allow him to. Although George King, his manager, worked hard to get him noticed, he didn't achieve success right away. The majority of his early work was unpaid. He performed anywhere he could at open mics, tiny clubs, and even the storied Café Wa, where Bob Dylan was just beginning his career. He gave performances in return for meals on some evenings. In 1963, he found a stable position at Page 3, a lesbian-run club located at 7th Avenue and West 10th Street. The club provided him with a genuine audience, but the salary was only $96 per month. He played 6 nights a week for an audience that welcomed his eccentricities. His performance of I Like Being a Girl quickly became a crowd favorite. He mastered switching between baritone and falsetto voices within a single song on Page 3. People started to view him as a genuine artist at this point rather than as a sideshow performer. The mainstream music industry was unsure of how to handle him, despite his rising fame in Greenwich Village. His odd appearance and high-pitched voice caused him to be written off as a novelty act. In the early 1960s, however, when the folk culture was flourishing, his appearances at places like Café Bazaar and the Fat Black Pussycat began to get notice. Despite their uncertainty about how to promote him, talent scouts took note. The ascent to fame of Tiny Tim started in February 1968. When he arrived at the Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In set. One of the most watched television programs, it was renowned for its fast-paced humor and unexpected guests. What came next was unexpected. With his long hair framing his pale face, Tiny Tim entered with a shopping bag and a ukulele. Dick Martin, his co-host, was clueless about his identity. Then Tiny Tim's high falsetto voice began to sing gently through the tulips, and he smiled brightly. A few audience members burst out laughing. In startled stillness, others sat. However, by the time his performance ended, everyone was listening. That was the event that made him famous overnight. His peculiar look and demeanor made him a perfect fit for the late 1960s emphasis on individualism during this period of transition. He wasn't merely a performer. He was a novel concept that had never been witnessed by anyone. Despite NBC officials' doubts about his ability to appeal to a broad audience, producer George Schlatter had faith in him. Tiny Tim received repeated invitations to return, and his fame grew with each performance. A recording deal with Reprise Records resulted from his triumph on Laugh-In later that year, a label that Frank Sinatra owns. His debut album, God Bless Tiny Tim, was released in April 1968. It featured a peculiar blend of original songs, vaudeville classics, and old Tin Pan Alley songs, all sung in his distinctive manner. The outstanding song, Tiptoe Through the Tulips, peaked at number 17 on the Billboard Hot 100 and became an unexpected hit. Richard Perry produced the record and went on to collaborate with Carly Simon and Barbra Streisand. Perry's addition of a sumptuous orchestration gave Tiny Tim's songs a sweeping, somewhat cinematic quality. The album was commended by some reviewers for bringing neglected American music back to life. Some thought it was a joke, but the CD sold well and the people adored it. The Other Side was one of the more outlandish tracks on the album. It's a song about melting ice caps with bizarre lyrics. It displayed a more profound and contemplative aspect of Tiny Tim's artistic abilities. He sang both portions of the song I Got You Babe, alternating between a deep baritone and a high falsetto. These were more than mere tricks. They demonstrated his breadth as a singer and his inventiveness in theater. By the end of 1968, he was all over. He made appearances on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, The Jackie Gleason Show, and The Ed Sullivan Show. For many, Tiny Tim was a mystery. He was viewed as a novelty act by the general public, a performer so odd that it was impossible to know if he was being serious or not. He was more than that to others, though. Both Andy Warhol and Bob Dylan viewed him as an artist who was revitalizing lost music. Legends like Frank Sinatra and Bing Crosby acknowledged his extensive knowledge of early American tunes. There weren't all fans. He was referred to be a gimmick by some reviewers who claimed he concealed his lack of aptitude behind his oddities. They saw him as merely a strange person who had struck it lucky. Regardless of the opinions of others, he had established himself as a cultural icon. It didn't matter if they were applauding him or laughing at him. With almost 20 appearances from 1968 to the early 1970s, Tiny Tim emerged as one of the most memorable guests on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. Everything changed with his debut appearance in April 1968. As soon as Carson released his first album, God Bless Tiny Tim, it sold more than 200,000 copies. His song, Tiptoe Through the Tulips, peaked at number 17 on the Billboard charts and became an unexpected smash. At 6 feet 1 inch, with long hair and a falsetto voice, Tiny Tim was unlike anyone audiences had seen before. He played old-fashioned songs on his ukulele and brought a mix of eccentricity and real musical talent. His performances left people fascinated. And even Carson seemed caught between amusement and amazement. Viewers couldn't get enough. NBC received so many letters asking for more that Tiny Tim became a regular guest. Carson enjoyed the energy Tiny Tim brought to the show. He was unpredictable. One moment he would be singing a love song from the 1920s. The next he would say something completely unexpected. This made him a guest that audiences had to see. But while many people loved him, others weren't sure if he was serious or playing a character. Either way, he was one of the most talked about figures of the time. By the mid-1970s, things changed. Public tastes moved toward rock music and mainstream pop. The novelty that had made Tiny Tim a star started to wear off. His appearances on The Tonight Show became less frequent. And his fame began to fade. But his time with Carson had already made history. On December 17, 1969, Tiny Tim had his biggest moment yet. He married 17-year-old Victoria Buetinger, known as Miss Vicky, live on The Tonight Show. It was a television event like no other. An estimated 45 million people tuned in, nearly 1/4 of the U.S. population. In the 1960s, only the moon landing had drawn more viewers. Carson made sure everyone knew it was real. During his monologue that night, he told the audience, "People have thought we've been kidding about Tiny Tim being married on the show. We are not." The set was decorated with thousands of Dutch tulips. When the ceremony ended, Carson toasted the couple with milk and honey instead of champagne, just as Tiny Tim had requested. The wedding was so big that crime rates reportedly dropped that night because so many people stayed home to watch. Tiny Tim later called himself the hottest talent in the whole country. But his marriage didn't last. He and Miss Vicky separated after 8 years. They had one child together before divorcing. Even though their relationship ended, the wedding remained one of the most famous moments in television history. Carson had a real appreciation for Tiny Tim. Some guests were treated as novelties or jokes, but Tiny Tim was always given space to talk. He had an incredible knowledge of early 20th century music and could discuss old songs and forgotten artists in detail. Carson seemed to respect this and often let him share his passion with the audience. Tiny Tim also had a way of surprising Carson. During one appearance, he casually announced his plans to marry Miss Vicky, leaving Carson momentarily speechless. No matter how strange things got, Carson handled it with humor and let Tiny Tim be himself. Carson also seemed protective of him. The audience laughed at Tiny Tim's eccentricity, but Carson made sure it never turned into outright ridicule. He found a way to keep things fun while showing real respect, which made Tiny Tim's appearances stand out even more. By the late 1970s, Tiny Tim's time in the spotlight had passed. His act, once exciting and fresh, struggled to keep up with changing times. He continued performing in smaller venues like community centers and circuses, but the massive TV appearances were over. The biggest blow came when Reprise Records dropped him. Without a label backing him, his career took a sharp downturn. Instead of giving up, he tried to take control of his own future. In 1971, he started Victim Records, a name that combined his with his wife's, Miss Vicky. Over the next year, the label released 5 singles, but none of them gained traction. The project failed, and Victim Records folded by 1972. Not long after, he started another label called Toilet Records, a name that reflected how he felt about his career at the time. He kept recording music through the 1970s and 1980s, but only for smaller labels. His albums found limited success, and some were only released overseas. With his mainstream career fading, he turned to any venue that would have him. He played at community centers, high school theaters, and even took his act abroad. In the late 1970s, he recorded albums in Australia, but they were only produced in small batches and never reached the US market. He wasn't selling out major venues anymore, but he was still performing. If nothing else, Victim Records proved one thing. Tiny Tim wasn't ready to walk away from show business. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, he found work in places most former stars wouldn't dare go. He became a regular on the carnival circuit and played in punk clubs, gay nightclubs, and any venue that would have him. Some might have seen this as a step down, but Tiny Tim saw it as a chance to keep doing what he loved. One of his strangest career moves came when he joined Roy Radden's Vaudeville Revue. This traveling show featured forgotten stars and odd novelty acts performing in small venues across America. He even joined a circus for a grueling 36-week tour. The conditions were tough and the pay wasn't what it used to be, but he was still in front of an audience. Despite being far from his Las Vegas heyday, he found an unexpected following in the punk rock scene. His bizarre style and refusal to conform fit well with the rebellious spirit of punk music. He even performed with Brave Combo, a Texas polka band known for their experimental sound. He had gone from being a mainstream oddity to an underground cult figure, and he embraced it. Then came the projects that left people confused, shocked, or both. In 1985, he released a song titled, "Santa Claus Has Got the AIDS This Year." The backlash was immediate. At the height of the AIDS crisis, many saw the song as insensitive and offensive. Tiny Tim later claimed it had nothing to do with the disease, but was instead a reference to AIDS, an appetite-suppressant candy that had fallen out of production due to its unfortunate name. No matter what he intended, the controversy damaged his reputation even further. If that wasn't strange enough, in 1987, he starred in Blood Harvest, a low-budget slasher film directed by Bill Rebane. He played a ukulele strumming clown named Marvelous Mervo, a character as unsettling as the movie itself. The film flopped and critics tore it apart, but over time, it became a cult favorite. Tiny Tim was one of the most unusual entertainers of his time. His high-pitched voice and love for old songs made him famous. But his personal life was even stranger. Behind the ukulele and oversized grin, he had habits that were almost impossible to explain. From extreme hygiene routines to bizarre spending habits, everything about him was out of the ordinary. He was obsessed with staying clean. Not just in a normal way, he took it to an extreme. He showered between 4 and 6 times a day, and claimed he had not missed a single shower since December 20, 1989. Cleanliness was more than just a habit for him. It was something he believed was necessary for purity. Even drying off had to be done a certain way. He refused to use regular towels because he thought they were full of germs. Instead, he only used disposable paper towels, specifically Job Squad or Bounty microwave varieties. His hygiene routine went beyond showering. He brushed his teeth 4 times a day using a mix of 3 different toothpaste brands, Crest, Maclean's, and Gleam. He believed this combination gave his teeth an unmatched shine. His obsession with appearance did not stop there. He spent massive amounts of money on cosmetics. He wasn't trying to look younger, cover up flaws. He simply admired beauty and wanted to surround himself with it. Sometimes he bought makeup just to feel closer to beautiful women. His managers constantly complained about his spending, calling it reckless and childish. Some of his other habits were even more unusual. He was fascinated by adult diapers and would talk about them with anyone willing to listen. Once, he ordered everything on a hotel menu, not because he was hungry, but because he wanted to arrange the food in an artistic display. When it was done, he walked away without taking a single bite. Even eating was something he approached differently. He hated eating in front of others, even his wives. Instead, he would sit alone and pretend he was hosting a grand dinner party, playing the role of every guest himself. His personal life was just as strange as his habits. His most famous relationship was with Victoria May Buetinger, known as Miss Vicky. On December 17, 1969, he married her on The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, in front of 45 million viewers. It was the second most watched television event of the decade, only behind the moon landing. He was 37 years old at the time. She was only 17. The 20-year age gap caused immediate controversy, but the spectacle of the wedding was all anyone could talk about. The ceremony was extravagant. The couple wore Victorian-style outfits designed by Jeffrey Martin, and the set was decorated with 10,000 tulips imported from Holland as a tribute to his hit song, Tiptoe Through the Tulips. But their marriage was troubled from the start. Miss Vicky later said they wanted completely different things. She hoped for stability in family life, while Tiny Tim was only focused on his career. They had one child, a daughter named Tulip Victoria. By the time their second anniversary arrived, they were already living apart. When Miss Vicky gave birth at 19, Tiny Tim was not even there. The couple officially divorced in 1977. But years later, she said she had no regrets. It had been an exciting experience, and as a young girl caught up in the moment, she had embraced it. Tiny Tim married twice more. In 1984, he married Jean Elvis, whom he called Miss John. But the marriage lasted only 6 months before they separated. People close to him said his unpredictable behavior and reluctance to settle down were part of the problem. His third wife, Susan Marie Gardner, known as Miss Sue, had been a fan of his since she was 12 years old. Their relationship started when she reached out to him during a tour. When they met for the first time, he immediately asked if she considered herself attractive. Despite the awkward beginning, they eventually married in August 1995 and lived together in Minneapolis until his death. One of the strangest things about his relationships was his view on commitment. On his wedding night with Miss Vicky, he told her he still planned to see other women. She was shocked, but this was simply how he saw relationships. He lived in his own world, following his own rules. Whether it was hygiene, money, or marriage, Tiny Tim never did things the way people expected. Tiny Tim's love for performing never faded, even when his body started failing him. On September 28, 1996, he stepped onto the stage at the Uke Expo in Montague, Massachusetts. He was 64 years old and had spent decades entertaining crowds with his ukulele and signature falsetto. That night, he barely made it through his first song. As he stood in front of 135 people, he suddenly collapsed, face first onto the stage. The audience sat frozen in shock before paramedics rushed in. Some people started crying, fearing the worst. He was taken to Franklin Medical Center in Greenfield, where doctors fought to stabilize him. He spent 11 days in intensive care before being discharged in serious condition. His heart was only working at 40% capacity. He had diabetes, congestive heart failure, and other serious health problems. Doctors warned him to stop performing. They even recommended heart surgery, but he refused. He didn't want scars. He wanted to keep the heart he was born with, no matter what. Despite everything, he kept pushing forward. He wasn't ready to give up the stage. 2 months later, on November 30, 1996, he arrived at a benefit concert for the Women's Club of Minneapolis. From the moment he stepped inside, it was clear something was wrong. He nearly fell at the entrance and struggled to climb the stairs. His wife, Susan Corey, begged him to sit down and rest. He refused. He had a show to do. By the time he took the stage, most of the audience had already left because of earlier delays. But that didn't stop him. He played a few songs before ending with his most famous one, Tiptoe Through the Tulips. As he sang, he suddenly stopped. He turned to Susan and told her he wasn't feeling well. She tried to help him back to their table, but before they got there, he collapsed. Paramedics performed CPR on the spot. They rushed him to Hennepin County Medical Center and spent over an hour trying to revive him. At 11:20 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Cardiac arrest had taken him. Susan later said that his last moments were peaceful. She believed he didn't feel any pain. The last thing he heard was applause. Tiny Tim spent his life devoted to music. And in the end, he never let it go. Tiptoe Through the Tulips began as a love song in 1929. Before taking a strange turn decades later. It was first recorded by Nick Lucas, a singer known for his smooth crooning style. Written by Al Dubin and Joe Burke for the Warner Brothers musical Gold Diggers of Broadway, the song played during a scene where dancers moved through a field of tulips. Lucas's version became a massive hit, selling over 3 million copies and becoming one of the first records to pass 2 million in sales. For years, it was remembered as a charming tune from the Roaring Twenties. Then came Tiny Tim. In 1968, he performed the song on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, and everything about it felt different. His high-pitched falsetto paired with a ukulele turned a once romantic ballad into something completely unexpected. Over time, the song found a new identity. It went from charming to bizarre, then from bizarre to unsettling. In Insidious, 2010, it was used in moments of supernatural horror. The contrast between the cheerful melody and the terrifying visuals turned it into one of the creepiest musical choices in modern cinema. What was once a love song had become a symbol of unease, even after all these years. Tiptoe Through the Tulips still lingers in pop culture. It has been featured in cartoons, advertisements, and countless media references. It remains unpredictable, shifting between nostalgia, humor, and horror, depending on where it appears. Thanks to Tiny Tim, a song from 1929 became more than just an old tune.